can do that. Okay, I think we're recording. I think we're good. Perfect. Bueno, let's get this started because I'm really excited about this topic. Primero, Andrés, thank you so much for taking time, because after I listened to the Radio Independencia episode on the insular cases, I was like, no, stop everything. I have to contact them and see if we could do an English interview, because I just want to say, I love your show, but I think there's so many people in the diaspora that, unfortunately, because of the fact that we've been sort of assimilated and because of like our lack of being able to speak Spanish, there are some people who do not have access to that. So I really wanted to take time to go over this. And before we dive into all the reasons why this is so important, I wanted to first ask you if you could introduce yourself to listeners and talk a little bit about yourself, your work, and also how did Radio Independencia start? That would be great.
All right. So first, thank you for having me. I love the opportunity, to talk about these matters, especially like you said, because in English, because I rarely get the opportunity to do so. And I think that we have a problem here in Puerto Rico, and we fight amongst each other, right? Or we talk amongst each other, but we don't talk to, or pay much attention to things that may happen where power actually resides, right? In the US, and especially with so many Puerto Ricans now, in the United States. So every time I get this opportunity, I like to, take advantage of it. And hopefully, even though I might be a little slow speaking English, maybe the ideas will come, sooner than I can actually say them. But I really love the opportunity. So, I'm an attorney, I'm a lawyer, but I studied political science here in Puerto Rico, and I've always been, politics, I think, has always been important to me, not the parties, but the politics, especially the fact that Puerto Rico remains a colony of the United States, right? It's something that from a very young age, I couldn't really comprehend how that could happen. So I studied political science in the University of Puerto Rico, then I studied law there. And I'm going to fast forward a bit. So there, I actually, I participated in some of the student movements that happened, especially in 2010, 2011, while I was in law school. And it really shaped me. So after I graduated, I pretty much all I've done professionally has been on the public side, you might say. I worked at the Department of Justice here in Puerto Rico. I was also a law clerk. And for the past 4 years now, I've been a legal aid to Representative Dennis Marquez from the Puerto Rican Independence Party. So my full-time job is actually in the House of Representatives in Puerto Rico. And more recently, I got the opportunity of running for the Senate for the District of San Juan here in Puerto Rico for the Puerto Rican Independence Party. That. So, when I got to Dennis's office, I met a person, Adriana Gutierrez, a colleague, and we immediately became friends and decided, why not take advantage of all these technologies that are out there. And in Puerto Rico, I don't think that I saw a podcast that really talked about political issues from Puerto Rico in Spanish, from our specific point of view, right? From the point of view of somebody who believes in Puerto Rican independence, Puerto Rican sovereignty, and also from a progressive standpoint, right? And so that's what we did with Radio Independencia, which is our baby, our project. And we're very happy with the success that we've had so far. We've had a lot of great interviews. So it's a podcast about politics, about law from our point of view, but it's not only about, formal stuff, you could say. We talk a lot about, things that are going on socially and as in movies and stuff like that. So that's pretty much Radio Independencia, and we've put a lot of work into it, and we're very happy that, to be able to use it as a platform to get our ideas to other people.
Yeah, I mean, you guys should be proud, because I love your dynamic. I love the people you bring on. You guys put a lot, I could tell you put a lot of work into it. And like you said, it gives people a chance to hear a different perspective that you don't hear on the island, like you said, often enough. So that's amazing. And you guys, your dynamic is very fun. So I'm going to plug everyone listening. Please stop what you're doing right now, pause the recording, and go subscribe to Radio Independencia, because it's amazing. So let's get started, because I want to really dive deep into the insular cases, because I think It's funny because especially when I reached out to you, this was before what happened at the Capitol here in the U.S. and what happened, recently, the recent events going on in politics and in our world right now. So I think it's very relevant considering some of the themes we're going to touch on. So I want to start by asking you, if you could put it in layman's terms, what are the insular cases and when did they come up?
All right, so I guess you could summarize them as follows. The insular cases is a series of cases decided by the Supreme Court of the United States, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, right? Right after they started, you could say right after the United States government invaded Puerto Rico in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. You might also say Spanish-Cuban-American War. So immediately, right, the court had to decide basically what to do or how the law was going to treat these new territories or these lands, right, these places. And they're pretty much, a lot of people summarize them as the, the controversy, the issue at hand. Even though there are a lot of cases, you could say that the real question was whether the Constitution of the United States followed the flag, right? Does that mean? And they decided ultimately in a series of cases that, as we might talk about later, that are still good law in the sense that they are how do you say, they're still the law in the United States. They're still valid. Yeah. In legal parlance, we say that this is good law, but I'm not saying, it's not that they're actually good, but that they are valid. So they ultimately, what the court did was decide that Puerto Rico was an unincorporated territory of the United States and thus belonged to, but was not a part of, the United States. And hence, the Constitution of the United States, that obviously limits the powers of especially the federal government, right, does not apply fully or equally or automatically in Puerto Rico as it does in the United States. And that's the holding, that's the most important part of what is called the insular cases.
Interesting. You mentioned a couple of things there I want to touch on. First of all, the flag, it doesn't follow the flag. So as a person who was born in the US, I was actually born in Springfield, Massachusetts. Both of my parents are from Puerto Rico, born in Ponce en Toa Baja. So we would go, to visit our family. We'd spend summers there. And I noticed that as a young kid, like you said, you notice these things and you're like, well, what does this mean? So the US flag and the Puerto Rican flag are both flying. Anywhere you go in Puerto Rico, you could see if there's a flag up, there's not just the Puerto Rican flag, there's also the US flag. However, it sounds like from what you're saying, there are different sort of things that apply in Puerto Rico that do not apply on the mainland and vice versa. So I guess, tell me a little bit more about why this came to be, or what are some of the sort of even the precedents for the insular cases. Is there anything that came before that?
I mean, yeah. So just a little bit of background, right? Because this happened in, Puerto Rico, as I said, became a possession of the United States in 1898, right? But the Declaration of Independence of the United States is from 1776, right? And the Constitution was enacted around 1787 and then adopted like 2 years later. So right after the Declaration of Independence, right, of course, the 13 colonies, but there was a lot of course, of territory to the west, right? So what the government did, right, there was a question as to, when the independence came, as to who actually was, you could say, the owner, who did that land belong to, right? So obviously what the government created the Northwest Ordinance, right? So that actually stated that everything that was, to the west of the Mississippi did not belong to any state, but belonged to the government of the United States of America. And the government, of course, kept expanding itself, right? It bought what was Louisiana from the French, which was a lot bigger back then, and it you could say stole or got into wars with Mexico, and actually took more of half of the Mexican territory. And what happened with those new territories was that they were always, because it says so in that, Northwest Ordinance, they were, the idea was always to populate them, to colonize it in the real sense of the word, right? To put Americans there. And ultimately, and the people there were granted some rights, and ultimately with the idea that they would become states of the union, which seems pretty normal. They didn't care that much that they were Indian or native peoples there, right? And ultimately, we all know what happened to them. But that was what happened a little beforehand, and we have to remember that in the 19th century, so there was a lot of ideas of what, white supremacy, but especially there was the idea of manifest destiny, that the United States was selected to bring democracy right upon the world and upon this lands. There was also the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which kind of served as to tell the Europe to get out of the Americas and have no more colonies. But it also was kind of an idea that from now on the United States would start to have more power around the area. So what happened was that for the first time after all the West was occupied, you could say, right? So for the first time, the United States entered into an international conflict, you could say abroad, right? That was when it entered the Spanish-American War. And the question then remained: what would happen to those new places, because they, contrary to what had happened to the West, or perhaps Alaska or Hawaii, that they were not unpopulated areas. They weren't, that were later filled with Americans, rather from people from the colonies, but were places that had their own identity, their own culture. They didn't come from the Anglo-Saxon background that predominated, at the time. And that's actually what happened. So in 1898, in July of 25th of July, they invaded, but the Treaty of Paris, that actually whereby Spain ceded Puerto Rico with no election and no referendum whether we wanted to become part of the United States.
Right.
Yeah. So so then Spain pretty much sold us, after they had already lost the war, right, to Spain. And there, in a little line, so they said that the future of the inhabitants of Puerto Rico and the political status would be decided by Congress. For the first time, they made, contrary to what had happened with all other territories up to that point, it made no mention of, whether or statehood. It made no mention of the Northwest Ordinance, because what the Northwest Ordinance did, it was adopted into the Constitution that came later in two clauses. One that said that Congress was, admitted the states of the Union, and the other that said that Congress would have the power to dispose of territory or possessions and establish the rules and regulations regarding the territory. That's what we call the territorial clause, right?
Yeah.
So in the Treaty of Paris, it said that Congress would determine the future and the political status of these inhabitants. And so after that, start the insular cases, and the court, starts pretty disemtangling disentangling or deciding trying to figure out what to do with all this, in their words, all these savages that rule these foreign lands.
Exactly. So yes, thank you for saying that, because I think that's part of the understanding the mindset of what was going on back then. And sort of, it's just so interesting to hear you talk about the Northwest Ordinance, and how, like you said, so many of the ideologies were like expansion and moving Americans, and like you said, colonizing the land to the west, even though it was populated, even though there were people there, going into that area. And then when they acquired, like you said, Puerto Rico as a property, it was a very different thing. It was like, oh no, we have to apply different things. And I remember during your interview, you had mentioned, or you guys had been talking about that so many people in law had studied the insular cases, and it was even hard for lawyers to understand why exactly those decisions came to be put together. I think a lot of what really is concerning is that there are so many people who are not Boricua, not from our community here in the US, who don't understand the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico. So essentially, as you just described, it's Congress who has in every sense, control over Puerto Rico in terms of what happens, right? So every law, every regulation is up to Congress.
Yeah, so basically in a from the beginning, what the insular cases did was establish, first invent this theory that there was something called incorporated territories, and there was something called unincorporated territories. In the first, in the former, you had the intention of making them states, and thus the Constitution would apply to those in those territories. Therefore, you could the Bill of Rights and the rights that every citizen and every person in the United States has would apply in those territories, even though they were not states. Of course, they couldn't vote or anything, because that's something else. That the voting, for example, and other things are reserved to the states. But still, the constitutional rights that individuals possess would apply in those territories. But what the court did was say, well, but there is something. Imagine what would happen if we granted these rights to anyone that we conquer. We would limit Congress's and the government's power to conquer people, and so that couldn't be. And actually, all the differences between the justices, the judges of the Supreme Court, was actually whether and they talked about imperialist versus not imperialist. And it's fascinating reading this now, because it's all there. It's not interpretation of my interpretation. It's actually based on express white supremacy and a misconception of what we are and of what we were back then. So they ultimately decided a couple of things. First, that the Constitution did not apply automatically in the unincorporated territory. And later on, they of course also made clear that Congress had plenary power over the territory, right? Basically, so in the United States, of course, the states have state sovereignty, a sort of sovereignty under the Constitution. So territories did not. Congress can do here things that it couldn't possibly do in states. So it also made clear after that, in another case, pretty much in 1922, Balzac versus Puerto Rico, that the incorporation of Puerto Rico would have to be explicit by Congress. Nothing implicit or tacit, no matter how many years passed of domination or relation, however you want to call it, can change that. And that case was decided because a couple of years before, in 1917, of course, Congress had imposed under the Jones Act the American citizenship in Puerto Rico. So even though we had, every important political figure here was imposed by the president, even though we had an executive council, which was a weird thing that was kind of like a Senate, but also had like judges and executive. It also had like executive officers, and we only had one elected chamber, right? La Cámara de Delegados. So when we became citizens statutorily in 1917, then a lot of people asked themselves, well, are we incorporated now? Does the Constitution apply? And that's what, when the United States Supreme Court clarified that no, that it had to be, Congress has plenary powers. It has to be explicit, and that the constitutional rights that apply in Puerto Rico, it's not by virtue of the Constitution, not by virtue of the United States exercising its sovereignty over Puerto Rico, but whether Congress actually had the intention of applying set rights in Puerto Rico, with the exception of what they called the fundamental rights, something that had to deal with the order, scheme of liberty, something that they did not define, and they did not, they wouldn't define. Yeah, right. And it would have to take decades, and under another doctrine that has absolutely nothing to do with Puerto Rico, but that deals with fundamental rights and which rights apply to the states, where we would find out, little by little, which constitutional rights apply in Puerto Rico.
It's interesting. So you mentioned incorporated versus not incorporated. why was, and I guess, you know, we talk about white supremacy, we could talk about obviously the discrimination that was occurring, but was there a lot of pressure in Puerto Rico during the time that it was not incorporated to get it to become incorporated during that time? Like
The
politically within the people, like was there any movement, or were people sort of more just like, this is where we are, this is what it
No,
is?
no, I don't think that was ever the
Though there was never a
the main idea, because
Mhm.
well, first, some people might have one, especially during the first half of the 20th century. A lot of people, many people even thought that, perhaps maybe thought that when the United States invaded and exerted their sovereignty here, they might actually free of Spain or something, or grant us sovereignty
Yes.
later. Some people perhaps may have wanted a lot fewer than today, may have wanted to become that fight to become, because there was nothing, because there was actually an invention. There was no such a thing. There was no such thing as an incorporated versus unincorporated. I don't think that
Right.
was the big fight. The big fight
Mhm.
would have been like it is today, whether, annexation, or,
Right.
to have a free Puerto Rico. But what did happen, and what was obviously very strong, was the fight to change, to end the colonial regime, which
Mhm.
before the Commonwealth and this illusion that we've had, was straightforward, right? And nobody wanted to have all the legislature, all the executive positions, all the judicial positions here imposed by the president and the American government. We had no democracy. We still don't have, but and back then we didn't
Exactly.
have an elected local government either, right? So
Right.
those were the big fights, I believe, that were going on back then.
Yeah. No, there's we could do, I mean, several episodes on what was going on at the time that the US invaded, because I do recall that, yes, there were conversations where many Puerto Ricans, especially those who were fighting to be free of Spain, thought that with the US invasion, another thing that people don't understand about Puerto Rico and the US, that there were many that thought that with US troops landing in Puerto Rico, that meant, okay, democracy, freedom, liberty, all of the things that the US is supposed to stand for. But as we're seeing, even discussing the insular cases, there were a lot of things that showed that the treatment of Puerto Rico was very different from, those on the mainland. Um, I want to, let's see, I want to talk a little bit about the discussion around like citizenship. A lot of people over here don't understand, like, well, how come they're citizens, and why was citizenship given to Puerto Rico? Is there a clear picture? Is there, I obviously have discovered why, but I mean, can you talk to people a little bit about why citizenship was granted in
I mean,
1917?
we can. There are a lot of theories, right? We could say it was done in what we now call the Jones Act of 1917. Also that year, that's because we've pretty much been governed by the United States through organic acts. We had first a military government of 2 years that
Mhm.
everybody here says a brief period of time. Well, in Afghanistan, the military government, I think, lasted less, but just to to point that
Wild.
out. After that, we had the Foraker Act, which was, of course, as I've stated, super colonial in nature. Then in 1917, we had the Jones Act that made changes in the legislature and other things. And again, some people might say granted. I say imposed citizenship over Puerto Ricans. It is said that the only legislative elected chamber here in Puerto Rico, like the Cámara de Delegados, led by Jose de Diego, actually voted uh, opposed that expressly through a resolution, because they knew
Mm.
that wasn't, that was not freedom, or annexation or anything. It was just, another colonial organic act.
Mhm.
So the reasons, some people say that it had to do with the First World War. Could have been. Some people say that that was not the case, because uh, Puerto Ricans already participated in the war. I'm not absolutely sure why that happened. It could be, for example, this was Woodrow Wilson, who was,
Mhm.
starting, was very instrumental in the League of Nations, that was prior to the United Nations, very important, to supposedly to end colonialism and all that. But the United States was not part of the League of Nations. So this is part of the hypocrisy that we usually see, right? So it's a lot of reasons. Also because it was, the Foraker Act and the all these organic ads, it really looked bad. I'm not sure that was enough, but still it was so obvious. How can you be complaining about colonialism, European colonialism in Africa, in
Yeah.
Asia, everywhere else, when you have that? So it could have also been to appease, assuage the arguments against the United States through those. Who knows? What we
Mhm.
know is that so by statute, we are American citizens, right? Because Congress said so. We didn't vote for it. There is no recognition, international or by the United States, of a Puerto Rican citizenship, as I would like. But that didn't change the colonial nature of Puerto Rico, because again, it's something of it has to do with the territory. So because constitutionally and legally we're treated literally as property, as just like the slaves were treated as property under
Mhm.
the territorial clause. It doesn't matter whether I'm an American citizen. For example, if I go to New York or Florida, I actually have the same rights as an American, right? But and if an American that has lived born and raised in the United States all his life or her life comes to Puerto Rico, so that person loses their rights, some of their rights, those that have to do with things like voting for the president and voting
Mhm.
for Congress people. But the differentiation is not the problem from my point of view. It's the
Right.
subordination of Puerto Rico, because while I don't vote for the president, executive action and all the federal government and federal agencies apply in Puerto Rico. And just, I don't vote. We don't have elected Congress people. We have one resident commissioner who does not vote
Right.
in the House. So one would think, well, then congressional laws, statutes cannot apply in Puerto Rico, but they can if Congress says so.
Mhm.
Equally, there is a federal law. There is a district court here in Puerto Rico, right? A federal court whose members, whose judges are appointed and confirmed by an institution in which we do not participate. And that, people who might be hearing this for the first time, is obviously colonialism. What was
Yeah.
colonialism in 1997 or 1998, 1898,
Mhm.
under Spain, all of a sudden changed name because, of course, the United States cannot have colonies. And we became what we are today. So with the imposition of citizenship, that didn't change, even though, as to individual rights or anything that has to do with citizenship, we are, like any other person. The thing is that in the United States, because of its constitutional development, there are a lot of rights that have to do with due process and have to do with the scheme of the Constitution, but are not necessarily tied to the citizenship. For example, the voting, the voting, because in the United States, people, it is the states and the people of the states that are represented in the Electoral College, and it is an indirect system of voting, which is awful, by the way. Then
Mhm.
that's why if you're here in the colony, then you don't vote. And just like that, and that is what allows also the fact that Congress has plenary powers, that allows Congress to differentiate and discriminate against Puerto Rico in the way that it wishes. So while it cannot discriminate between states, for example, it cannot impose a tax, one tax to New York and another to Florida and such things, or it can do so to Puerto Rico when it grants, I don't know, Medicaid, Medicare, or any federal program of assistance. Uh,
Mhm.
it cannot discriminate between states, but it can afford less protections or give more protections if it wanted to the unincorporated territory, because basically legally, even though even though sociologically and politically we are a nation, right? Legally and constitutionally, they decided that we are merely, as a city of Congress, we are basically an instrumentality of Congress. They actually treat us as if we were Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, detention center, military
Exactly.
base, and not
Yeah.
Cuba, for example, which is crazy. And that's
Yeah.
the relationship that that to this day governs the the United States and Puerto Rico.
Yeah. And it's great that you narrowed in on that word, granted citizenship. It's like you said, it's an imposition. And I think this speaks to a lot of like the languages that are used, the way language is used to hide this, what is really systemic racism. It's a very systemic way in which through the law they have forced Puerto Rico to have, like you said, certain rights you could have here that you can't have there. That's really impactful. The idea that like someone can go to Puerto Rico, move to Puerto Rico, and some of their rights may be taken away. And I don't think enough people understand that. I want to talk a little bit about 1952. Can you go over what happened in 1952, especially in terms of the language and what, how, like you said, people are glossing over the fact that this is a colony or trying to hide or paint a certain picture about what the relationship is.
Yeah, sure. So, to Puerto Ricans, 52 is, like the year. It's a year that for many of us, we were taught that supposedly, that things changed. Puerto Rico ceased to be a colony of the United States because they don't tell you, but in 1950, Congress passed a statute, Ley 600, no? 600 Act, which allowed the Puerto Rican people to enact their own constitution. And through that process, we had a process here that actually was in which, because we knew it was a colonial act, that the independence movement did not participate. And in fact, the Puerto Rican the Nationalist Party of Albizu Campos started an insurrection in 1950. So what happened was that supposedly things were gonna change. But what happened was that, yes, we enacted a constitution, right? And which was accepted and then changed unilaterally by Congress, and they took some language out that sounded, it had to do with rights of labor and education, and that sounded too socialist, and they took it out.
Wow.
Yeah, and so ultimately we enacted the constitution of here in Spanish we call it the Estado Libre Asociado. In English it was named the Commonwealth. One thing there's nothing to do with the other. The literal translation would be like the free associated state, but it was neither free nor really associated nor a state. But
right.
So what happened, so this arose, and with the power that you have to understand that in the 40s, you had FDR in the United States, more of a, public, there was a lot of things going on in investment through public institutions because of FDR and the New Deal and such things. So here we had another, one of the last of the military and American governors imposed here, who started working with this up and coming leader here, of the first. It was an independence party and a left-wing party, which was the Popular Democratic Party under Luis Muñoz Marín. But then immediately they switched and they, became the most colonial party and now pretty much a center-right party. But under Luis Muñoz Marín, they saw this idea that Puerto Rico had become self-governed. They had a self-government and was no longer a territory. And thus, they were able to pretty much fool the United Nations into allowing the United States to take Puerto Rico off the colonies list that they had, under which the metropolitan powers had to, hand in reports and, tell the UN what they were doing to let go of their colonies. So we were taken out. And after that, yes, we were organized under what seems like a state, in the sense that we supposedly have a Republican form of government. We elect a governor, of course, not a president or a prime minister. We have a Senate and a House, just like you would imagine. We have our own judicial system, like in any state. But the thing is, we have the federals and the colonialists and everybody else, the fact that we still have the application of all that federal system without federal representation, they don't care. It's like they say, well, we ceded that or something like that. They think they invented the European Union. They're crazy. But so the idea was that after 1952, Congress was, didn't have any plenary powers over Puerto Rico. The idea that they could, and of course you might know what promesa is, but that they could legislate in Puerto Rican internal affairs was crazy. It was a thing of just the independentistas and all of that. And that we in Puerto Rico, well, I belong to a minority here, pro-independence, who didn't believe that, and but actually we were the only ones actually saying that, because even pro-annexation forces, it was kind of that they wouldn't insult the U.S. by saying that they did such a monumental hoax, right? But the hegemony here was all of the Popular Democratic Party, and that idea that Puerto Rico was something different and self-governed, and we were the best of both worlds, and we unite Latin America and the United States, and we have this special relationship with the U.S. Was sold in Puerto Rico, was very strong for 50 years, and it was very difficult to go against that, even though independentistas, of course, always did. But lately, and I don't want to get I want to fast forward too much, but the last 15 years, especially the last 6 years, have, of course, taken all that falsity or all those falsehoods totally down, with the imposition of promesa, with the imposition of a Junta de Control Fiscal, Fiscal Control Board, with the decision of Sanchez Valle, which we can go into later, which, so pretty much, at least today, and people growing up, I think that they cannot possibly be believe or be told the same lies that we were fed, as if they were the true sociological, political, legal, and constitutional realities, because they have been taken down by by the truth, what has happened.
Right. Yeah, it's going back to what you said about in the 50s, how was that I also want people to understand, because I know a lot, but I want to make sure the listeners, 1952, was that when the first governor of Puerto Rico that was Puerto Rican was put into power? Or
actually no, because look how things are. That's another thing. If one looks at the thing, because a lot of people say, well, it was the Commonwealth, right? They took us out and they put us shoes, they brought us shoes and all that and all. No, actually, it was a statute by Congress that so the first Puerto Rican governor here was in 1946, if I'm not mistaken. It was Jesus T. Piñero. He was actually imposed by the president, just like all the American presidents were imposed, before, by all the governors. Were imposed by the president. In 1946, we had the first Puerto Rican governor, and it was Jesus T. Piñero. Why wasn't it the Senate leader, the Popular Democratic leader? Probably because he wanted to be elected, probably, and he didn't want to. Maybe he said, "Well, this is coming. We're working towards this, so I'm gonna hold my horses." Because in 1948 there was a statute, congressional statute. Puerto Ricans had nothing to do with it. So there was a statute that allowed Puerto Ricans to have their governor. So as you can see, this was 4 years prior to the Constitution, because we believe that the ELA, the Commonwealth, changed things. It is a constitution, but didn't alter the plenary powers that we already talked about, and all everything that we talked about. So in 1948, Luis Muñoz Marín, Luis Muñoz Marín becomes the first elected Puerto Rican governor in Puerto Rico. But this was prior to the Commonwealth, and of course he would go on to win like 4 terms after that, cementing all these lies, ideologies of lies, and of course criminalizing. We don't have time to go over this, but with all this came a very hard criminalization of the independence movement that was happened beforehand, but also with things like Las Carpetas, which is the profiling of Puerto Rican independence group and left-wing groups, but mostly independentistas, by the federal government, but especially by the Puerto Rican government led by Luis Muñoz Marín. And if you were an independentista, they profiled you, they opened a carpeta, a file, and they pretty much made your life very miserable. And that happened pretty much for 40 or 48 years officially here.
Yeah, there is a lot of history that's hidden, or is it well known, or hasn't been taught in the history books, or even hasn't been taught in Puerto Rico. When you say, when you were talking about Luis Muñoz Marín, basically, so what you're saying is before ELA, and after it, like, nothing had changed. The people in power were still in power, but people were sort of, I guess, insinuating that this is going to bring change to the island. Is that what I'm
Because,
understanding?
well, I mean, to be, let's say that one thing changed. A constitution was enacted, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So now we would elect, well, we already had the elected government, right? But now we'd have una carta de derechos, right? Or a bill of rights.
Bill of
We
Rights,
would
yeah.
have a sort of a republican form of government. We would have the everything would be kind of like a state, and we did have a constitution. Yes, that changed. Yes, but there are a lot of things that already changed. The most important thing that people have to understand is that they changed because of a congressional statute, because of how the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, would say then and now, because of the congressional grace, not because not because Congress ceded any of its
Power,
self,
right.
yeah, because the power that they hold through conquest,
Exactly.
because we still again don't participate in the federal process that applies here, and because Congress through many years perhaps treated tread lightly, you might say, or they could, a lot of people could say that, well, now no, we're something different, we're kind of like a state, even though we have sporting sovereignty, which can be taken away by Congress if it wanted to, or all these, and they said, well, this is something new. And even though we didn't have like a Puerto Rican dollar or anything else, right? Even though we like the military, so the colonialistas here basically said that, well, no, this is as if we were the European Union. They say we have a common monetary arrangement and a common defense. Common, it's all American. I never saw Lolita Lebron or Abisu Campos or anybody. So it's colonialism is really crazy. But that's what happened. So I mean, one thing changed. Yes, there was a constitution, and a constitution grants certain powers, of course, and restricts what the local government can do, and it binds Puerto Ricans, and we have to abide by, and we have rights under that constitution. Yes, and some of those rights predated the just like the right to elect the legislature and the governor, those predated the constitution. That had nothing to do, or it wasn't new with the constitution. But the important thing is that with regard to the congressional power and the power that the United States exerts over Puerto Rico, that's a real dilemma that we were told lies about forever. That didn't change, and now more than ever we know that that is the case, and we've been told that by, of course, the executive branch in the case of Sanchez Valle and others, by the judicial branch in Sanchez Valle and many others, and by Congress with Promesa and the Junta de Control Fiscal. And we could go on. I could give you a lot of examples of this, let's say, differentiate that different statutory treatment, congressional treatment with regard to Puerto Rico that could only happen because of the territorial nature of Puerto Rico. Here, a lot of the same people that argue that Puerto Rico ceased to be a colony from the Popular Democratic Party were in love with the Sección 936, right? The 936 section of the Código de Rentas Internas of the United States, right? Which granted a lot of, I'm not going to bore you, but it basically granted a lot of tax incentives to American corporations to relocate to Puerto Rico, right? And that brought a lot of those companies to Puerto Rico because they didn't have to pay taxes. So the only reason why, as we discussed earlier, why that could happen is because Congress could differentiate with regard to the territory, whether good or bad. And
Right.
while that happened, and a lot of other instances of congressional statutes that apply to Puerto Rico but don't apply elsewhere, or different treatment in social welfare programs, even though that was there and everybody knew it, somehow a lot of people still argued that Puerto Rico was not a territory, which of course is crazy.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because when you talk about sort of the fact that Congress has so much power, it's so weird how, like, in some ways, even for me growing up, you don't realize that, even within Puerto Rico, people feel a sense of like, oh, well, we, like you said, we have a governor, we can vote, we could do this. But if you kind of look under the surface, you could kind of see certain things that make you sort of wonder, like, what exactly is this? So um, I would ask you, you mentioned this ELA did cause a lot of people to sort of have this belief that perhaps there's some sense of like equality there. But I would ask you now, the insular cases, are they discussed today? You had mentioned that there's sort of like more of a movement understanding sort of like the real status of Puerto Rico with the US. Would you say that now people understand a little bit more about the insular cases, or what's the impact on Puerto Rico today with regard to that?
Perhaps not the insular cases. I would say that today, but the colonial nature of the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico is more clear perhaps than ever before. And I think that my arguments, or what I'm saying, a lot of people, even though they might not agree with the solution that I advance, right, or they might not favor, they might not see life the way I see it politically, that's fine. At least they agree, with the description that I've made. And this is totally different than perhaps 15, 20, 30 years ago, which, a lot of the mainstream here in Puerto Rico and in the United States would say, oh my God, please, Congress has no such power. That's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, and I think because of Promesa, because of the Junta de Control Fiscal, because of the deterioration of the relationship and the economic circumstances, because of the because the Section 936 actually were phased out by Clinton. So all this has made the economic situation here, the political situation, far worse than it ever was. And now people are more clear with regard to this relationship. But the thing with the insular cases first is that for many, again, I reiterate that for many years, even in law school, they tell you, oh, that's not good law. That's not, that's a thing from a bygone era. But also it's really a technical thing, right? It's kind of a lawyerly thing. And, who cares? Unincorporated territory, what applies, what doesn't. The truth is that it wasn't taught properly here. Many of the best constitutional scholars in the United States, I would say, didn't even know about it. I'm talking about the best of the best.
That's crazy.
Some might know it, but it just wasn't important to them. First, because Puerto Rico was irrelevant. And lately, with the hurricanes, with Trump, with everything else, perhaps with the debt, with all Promesa, perhaps we kind of reached a level of notoriety that maybe, never in my life, perhaps, had we had. But first, they didn't. Maybe it wasn't good law to them. Second, it wasn't on their radar. They didn't care. And third, it's kind of technical. And in Puerto Rico, it wasn't taught. It wasn't taught the way I'm talking about it. It was actually, if it was taught in law school, it was as a historical thing.
Like dismissed. That's something over there that we're not. It's funny because the way you say that is like, oh yeah, like here's like a sentence, and then let's move on to the next thing.
It is crazy. It is crazy, and I kind of understand it, because it's really hard to tell someone, like, yeah, I live in a colony, and yeah, I don't vote for the guy who actually has the power. It's humiliating. It's hard to take, because then again, you say like, well, why don't you rebel? And they're right. Why don't we rebel? So but it's what's actually happened. But again, but one thing that we cannot do, and even lawyers like me, we cannot let all this, because this is an invention. This is just colonialism, and people know what colonialism is, and they've known forever. So we cannot let all this jargon confuse us. And I believe really that a lot of people now more than ever, and that has been reflected in the elections lately, understand that this subordination cannot go on. And even those more colonialist positions in Puerto Rico and people have shifted. And sometimes in the Popular Democratic Party, even though it doesn't really mean anything, it doesn't have substance, at least they'll tell you, yeah, well, I'm a soberanista, whatever that means coming from them. But at least they acknowledge now that the position that they held forever, and that there are forefathers that told them forever, it's just laughable today. So because they cannot go in front of a camera and tell you that we're not a colony, they go on and say something like, oh, we have to move towards sovereignty or something like that, which is fine, but they don't do anything about it, because they're really perfectly fine with the situation that we have, because they were told so for so many years that it's really hard to change your political views at this point.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk about the insular cases. I know we could go on for hours and hours at a time,
Thank
but I
you.
really appreciate what you said too about like this idea that, and I think this is important for people to understand about this, that this is an issue that, again, because of colonialism, because of trying to hide the power dynamics, many people don't understand what the actual reality is. But I'm happy to hear that more and more people are understanding that Puerto Rico, yes, is a colony. Um, just one last thing, I guess, to ask you about, as you mentioned, the elections, the latest elections, because I want people to kind of have some context into today, how things are kind of going. It, at least from my understanding, it sounds like there were a lot of almost gains in almost like third party or independence movements, and I want you to kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so as people might know, we for the first time ever we expelled the governor here in the what we call el verano del 19, right, the summer of
Yeah.
2019, Ricardo Rosselló, which was a pro annexation PNP Partido Nuevo Progresista governor, which was many of us wouldn't have thought this possible, right?
Even
And it was a
possible,
great,
yeah.
yeah, it was a great movement. So in the past few years and election cycles, we've seen uh, um, the deterioration of the two most important parties in Puerto Rico. And we've seen it because even though they've won with less and less votes each time. And just like in the United States, we have a big problem here that because two parties dominate politics, and I participate in the military in the Puerto Rican Independence Party, which it's a party that's been, given the fight for over 70 years. And we've been able to put people in the legislature, even though we don't win the governorship or anything else. Um, but in this last cycle, we knew, everybody knew that something seemed kind of different, right? And a lot of people, there's been strong movements from feminist groups, from labor groups, and from independentistas also. And we knew that we expected something bigger. And in fact, we for the first time a governor here, yes, the PNP, the annexation party, won the governorship, but only with 31, 32% of the people
Wow.
voted for him. Because in Puerto Rico, even though the Puerto Rican Independence Party has advanced legislation to have una segunda vuelta, right, a second wave, as in many other places on earth, we don't have that. We don't have the ability to have like to do real arrangement between parties like it happens in other places, something that we've also advanced legislatively. So what happened? Yes, they won with 32%, which one might say like 68% didn't vote for the governor, right? That's
Right.
something. But also, so the Popular Democratic Party, the other party, the annexation party lost the both chambers in the legislature, which is something. But more importantly, the Popular Democratic Party didn't have a majority either in the Senate. So for
Wow.
and they have a slim, they have actually they needed, it's 51 members in the House, and they have 26. So it's by one representative they have the majority, but only by one. So
Wow.
what happened? For the first time, the Puerto Rican Independence Party had their best electoral result since 1952. It had 18% of the votes, and for the past 20 years, we were in 2 and 3%. We had 7 times more votes this time. Also, our candidates were first in the Senate. Maria Lourdes Santiago was first of the senators in voting. Dennis Marquez was second, but a very strong showing, right? And also other parties like Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana was able to have 2 legislators in each chamber. Even a more conservative party like Proyecto Dignidad, very conservative, religious, new party, but it was still a new party. They had 7% for governorship. Victoria Ciudadana had also 14%. They had a little bit more than the PIP, but less than 1 point. So,
Wow.
it's really unprecedented. And so the Proyecto Dignidad also had 1 new legislator in each chamber. And there's also Vargas Bidot, who is an independent in the Senate. So for the first time, it's not only a divided government, as we say here, it's also that even in the legislature, there is no clear majority in one chamber, but
Wow.
really in either chamber. And people have to understand that that's something. I mean, something is changing.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in Guanica, there's a guy who, well, you know, it's very complicated, but through what we call here nominación directa, which is, you know, by name, your name is not even on the ballot, and that guy is fighting to win the mayorship, which is
Wow.
unheard of. So that's something very good that happened this cycle, and I strongly believe that little by little the electorate is changing, and that we're making way towards, you know, from my point of view, destroying the bipartisanship of these
Good.
two colonial but also right-wing parties in Puerto Rico that are also, because it's not only about status and not only about ideology, they've been totally corrupt, right?
Right.
And they've done very bad things to Puerto Rico. And even though we don't have the power yet, I think we're making progress, and you know, there are good things to look forward to.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I wanted to, I'm glad we're ending it on a good note, because yeah, I think that's part of why I wanted to even discuss the insular cases. I think this is part of it, having a discussion, sharing, because there's so much. I'm sure I will invite you to come on the podcast again to just talk about other things that we brought up today. But there's so much that still needs to be known, and I think, like you said, people are starting to understand and starting to see things that perhaps were under the surface. So I want to just thank you. I appreciate you for taking the time. And is there anything else you wanted to say about either insular cases or anything else that we've
No,
discussed?
again, just thank you for the opportunity. I really, you know, tell people that might be listening or seeing this it sounds crazy, but it is. And any help that we can get, whether you're Puerto Rican here in Puerto Rico, in the United States, or even if you're not Puerto Rican, better. You know,
Definitely.
people have to understand that this is not okay. This is undemocratic, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we have to end this subordination of Puerto Rico, so that we can have the type of government that we need. And then, you know, it doesn't matter if whether it's left wing or right wing, but we have to determine that, or we need the power to determine that, because we might do any type of change that we want here in Puerto Rico, and Congress could just, you know, shut that down. And one
Yeah.
last thing that I really like to point out every time I get the opportunity, especially progressives and left-wing groups and activists in the United States, you cannot assume that you know, that Puerto Rico is just an ethnic minority with the same history and as other groups or fights struggles in the United States, and that therefore the solution is obviously to treat us equally as American citizens by granting us statehood. Much less say, well, you would have one more state that is democratic, because that's you know, that is the culmination of colonialism. That is a decision for
Mm-hmm.
Puerto Ricans to make, and from our point of view, it is, of course, what we want is the recognition of Puerto Rican sovereignty to be another nation like the United States, like every other nation in the world. So that is not a solution, and one might expect people with the background, with the knowledge, you know, of struggles in the United States and in other places, to understand these differences and the impact of colonialism and imperialism in many places. So when I hear a lot of people, because they truly might not believe in the, you know, might not want discrimination, and might not think that of course they go out of their way and say, oh, of course statehood. Well, hold your horses, because then you're lying. And what's very funny is that you might be becoming the best ally of the Puerto Rican right,
Exactly.
and
Yes.
ignoring the Puerto Rican
Mm-hmm.
left, which historically has predominantly been pro independentista and pro, you know, sovereignty and pro independence. So every time I get the opportunity, I say that, because I follow a lot of outlets and a lot of
Yes.
people that I respect and that I learn from, and then they talk about Puerto Rico, and I say that
No.
yeah,
I
I
do the
say
same
something
thing.
that it's
I,
crazy.
I'm quick too. I'm on Twitter and I'm like, hey, by the way, did you know this? Did you know that? I'm
Yeah,
very quick with my links and my, hey, can you, before you speak on this, you need to know the context. You should talk to a Puerto Rican. You should,
yeah,
just assume. So thank you so much. I am
I
with
appreciate
you
it.
100% on that.
So thank
um,
you.
Well, thank you so much for everything. I'm going to put this up, and where can people, if people want to find you or speak to you, where
Yeah,
can they find you?
definitely look us up. I have my own social media accounts, but look us up through Radio Independencia in Spanish, Independence Radio. We are, of course, please subscribe to our channel in YouTube. Right, everything we've done is in Spanish, but maybe in the future we can incorporate it. We do this on our free time, but if I had the resources, we do a lot of more things, and hopefully maybe we can do something in English. But look us up, subscribe on your YouTube channel, and look us up on your favorite podcasting platform.
Perfect.
We're on all of those, and social media: Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Radio Independencia. I don't know the handles, whatever. Just look
I'll
for
share
Radio
them.
Independencia. Yeah. Andrés
Perfect.
González, Adriana Gutierrez, and there you can write to us whenever you want, and we'll be there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Awesome. Thank you. Have a good night. And
You
I'm
too.
excited to share this.
All right.
Bye.